Hi, bonjour. My name is Stephan Dube. I'm the lead UX UI designer at Ready at Dawn, a Facebook studio. I've been working in the game industry for over 24 years. My background includes studying graphic design and 3D animation. I got into UI by pure accident, and I'm so grateful for it. Generating a functional and aesthetic pleasing UI has always been the core foundation of who I am as a UX and a UI designer. I've been working in VR for several years now, and with the help of Adobe products, I can build all my visual art. I use Photoshop and Illustrator for my art. Then to create my wireframes and prototypes, I use Adobe XD. I also use After Effects when I'm creating my UI motion graphic animations, which is a very helpful tool to do animation mockups. When I first started in the game industry, UX was not a term that people would commonly use. It actually didn't exist. The gaming industry has recently evolved, and now UX is a discipline by itself. Due to this evolution, UI artists need to adapt and learn UX as a skill set, making them a hybrid of a UX and a UI designer such as myself. To be a UI artist, one needs to wear many different hats. And what I mean by this is that the industry keeps evolving and creating more complex games. The role of a UX and UI designer also needs to evolve by keeping up with the demand. We always want to raise the bar when it comes to quality and user experience. For this to happen, one needs to be very adaptable and learn new skill set. The process of taking an idea and making it into the game engine is an elaborate task in and out of itself. During my talk, I plan to discuss the role of a generic UI department. I also want to talk briefly on the process and the roles, starting with UX, then UI, and finally the UI engineer. I will then provide some tips and tricks for UI artists that I commonly use in production to work in a non-destructive way. Before we break down the process a bit, let's be clear that every game studio is different in one way or another. What works for one studio may not work for another. However, the basic principle should be the same. To understand the process, we first need to define the roles that compose of an ideal UX and UI team. UX designer. A UX designer is focused on all aspects of products developing usability, flows, and accessibility. They usually work closely with the game designer and the UI artists. User interface designer. A user interface designer is the visual artist that will focus on the look and the style of the menus and the HUD. The HUD, or heads-up display, is how the information is visually displayed to the players as part of the game user interface. UI engineer. The UI engineer builds the backend of the UI system from the UX designer's prototype. Oftentimes, they will use programming languages such as C# or Visual Basic. You can see from this diagram that each discipline contributes to the production pipeline. The red circle is the UX designer. We can see keywords like tutorials, analytics, which are key components for onboarding the players. The blue circle is the UI designer, which handles the visual side of things. They are responsible for the visual style guide, typography, and graphic design of the game. The green circle is the UI engineer. They are responsible for implementation and scripting part of the game. Now, let's talk about the process. The UI team reviews the game design document, or GDD, from the game designer. This is our brief, a request from the game designer. I see the role of the game designer as my client. They are who I need to deliver my service to. We start by having a kickoff meeting with the producer, art director, game designer, and everyone from the UI team. The game designer will share their thoughts, for example, why a store is needed and how it should work. The conversation continues with everyone asking questions, discussing hurdle, and vetting any implications for this new feature. In this scenario, let's say the game designer would like to add a feature to monetize the game, whereas other games are free to download. We call these free to download games free to play, such as Ready at Dawn's Echo VR on Oculus Quest 2. Creating a store is another way for a game studio to generate revenue and allows the player to personalize their experience. Character skins, animation, upgrades, and more can be all purchased within the store. With all that content to browse and buy, a store can be a fairly complex system in a video game. Once the kickoff meeting is done, everyone on the UI team should have a solid understanding of how they can contribute to the task at hand. We break down the task into 3 sections: UX, UI, and then the UI engineer. The UX designer will start thinking of flows and where are the needs of the user. At this point, the UX designer is building a product and following all the proper steps for UX design. These steps include conducting research, creating flows, drafting wireframes, and finally an interactive prototype. That's where Adobe XD comes into our production pipeline. Once a prototype is generated and user feedback is collected, we iterate on the prototype, making changes that are beneficial to the game and resolving any issues that may have risen. Adobe XD makes it very easy to collect user feedback by simply sending out a URL link to any user testers. And since Adobe XD uses the power of the Creative Cloud, we are able to work collaboratively as well. Once the wireframes are approved, the UX designer shares their prototype with the UI engineer, and they can start building the backend by using simply gray boxes. What are gray boxes? Gray boxes are used to implement the backend behavior of a feature. The logic comes from UX design as well as the prototype, which could be emulated into the actual game to get more gameplay feedback through testing. It is very beneficial to use gray boxes because it's easy to update, cost-effective, and it's uber fast. Remember, the UI engineer doesn't need beautiful art at this point. What they need is to understand the flow of things, thinking of the consequences for each click the player may do. With the Adobe XD prototype, the UI engineer has a clear idea of what needs to happen by mirroring the user experience of the prototype to the game engine. Again, no need for beautiful artwork, only a prototype with the proper flow is necessary. The next step is creating an aesthetic pleasing user interface, the UI. By generating some mockups, you can start building a library to be used as a style guide. The UI artist also works closely with the art director who guides the style and mood of the UI so it can match the game experience. The UI designer will also use the Adobe XD prototype to see how the wireframes are built, understand the hierarchy, and use the layout when building the mockups. Their goal is to reskin all the gray boxes that the engineer created. Learning how to do motion graphics can be a very beneficial skill set for a UI designer. UI designers have the choice to animate on-screen elements in the menu or in the HUD. For example, creating a menu transition. How does the store appear from the menu? Is it built on, or does it simply fade in and out? It's a good idea to prototype these type of animations. Instead of building everything into the game engine, you can easily do a mockup using After Effects. However, if you want to quickly block in some animation to get a feel for the interaction and to elicit feedback, I can prototype right into Adobe XD. Then, when I want to push the animation even further, I'll use After Effects. And pro tip, you can accelerate your workflow by exporting your design from Adobe XD right into After Effects. Personally, I simply build my motion in After Effects. However, when I'm breaking down my art assets from my Photoshop mockups, I make sure that the size of the textures is the correct size for the game engine. For example, in Unreal UMG, your canvas texture size needs to be a value of divisible by 4, not power of 2. What is divisible by 4? It's when the size of the canvas width and height has a value that can be divided by a value of 4 and equals a whole number. For example, 12 pixels by 24 pixels can be divided by 4 evenly. However, a value of 14 pixels by 26 pixels wouldn't work because the result is not a whole number when divided by 4. When I break down my art assets to animate in After Effects, I make sure that my art source has a canvas size divisible by 4. The reason why I do this is that once I get approval from the other task holder, like the art director, producer, game designer, I can simply take my art folder from After Effects and import it directly into the game engine. This cuts down on redoing a lot of work and saves time. Another benefit from working in After Effects is that I can copy my F-curves values and mimic them into the Unreal or any other game engine. I also take this opportunity to make any art asset that I see fit to be white and fully opaque and use the tinting functionality in the alpha controls of the game engine. The purpose of this was to save memory and also to be able to have the flexibility of using repetitive textures with different colors and opacity values. Now, developing the first-time user experience, the FTUE, for Lone Echo 2, our goal was to add a robust accessibility options. We present the player with colorblind options and then the type of turning pivot they would like to experience throughout the game. We offer two types of turning options: incremental turning and smooth turning. For some players, smooth turning could create nausea. Therefore, incremental turning could be a better option for them. To illustrate the two different types of turning, I rendered out a small video from After Effects. In previous versions of Adobe XD, you were not able to import and play videos. This changes now. I am very excited to introduce you a new feature in Adobe XD. You can now implement videos directly into Adobe XD. Let me show you how. As you can see, I have two different MP4 file video formats. One is the incremental turning video, and the other is the smooth turning video. By clicking and dragging the videos onto my XD canvas, I am able to import my videos. Once a video is selected, on the right-hand side in the property panel, a video property will appear. This allows the user to play a thumbnail preview of the video. They will see a timeline for their video playback. Below the timeline is a Start Play button to play the video. Also, an option for the sound on and off. The user can trim the video to their liking by doing simple edits to it. Another option is the loop playback that will loop the video. There are three different types of playback: play on tap, play automatic, and no playback. You can also edit your playback for your prototype by selecting Edit Playback. Now, when I hit play on my prototype, you can see that I have my two videos. On the left-hand side, I have incremental turning video playing. And then on the right-hand side, I have my smooth turning video playing. So you can see I can now play videos into my Adobe XD prototype. Now, let's discuss multiple flows. In Lone Echo 2, Adobe XD was used to prototype two different flows for our new and returning players. First is the FTUE, First Time User Experience. The first time a player loads our game, they will be introduced to some accessibility options. These include language and subtitle, incremental turning and smooth turning, and colorblind settings. Returning players will have a different interface since they already went through the FTUE and their preferences has been saved within the player's profile. Returning players have the following option: New Game, Continue, Load Game, Quit, Settings, and Credits. Having the ability to create multiple flows in Adobe XD is incredibly powerful as it provides an accurate representation of the game. Now, let's talk about scale, proportion, hierarchy in a design. Since I'm a hybrid of a UX and UI designer, I try to work smarter and not harder when building a prototype. Instead of using simple boxes for my wireframes, I use shapes in my prototype that will have the same scale and proportions. I also mirror the same hierarchy that I intend to use for my Photoshop mockups. An example of this is my personal project, BATTLERIGS, which you can view from my personal website, stephandube.com. When I designed this prototype, I kept in mind the visual language I wanted to convey for my visual mockup. My first step was to generate a mind map for this fictional game. I wanted to create a personal project that was fun and also showcase my ability to be a UX and a UI designer. Once done, I used Adobe XD to build the interactive prototype. My goal was to showcase the flow, but also the information hierarchy of each page the player interacts with. I also took the extra step to generate a font that uses the PS4 and Xbox face buttons, which anyone can download from my website. Simply look for the PS4 and Xbox link in the footer. The font is great for making prototypes. The lowercase is all Xbox buttons, while uppercase are all PS4 buttons. The legend bar at the bottom of the screen ends where all the information buttons are for BATTLERIGS. Using my font in Adobe XD, I can quickly build a prototype that uses the controller. Now, anyone that I share my interactive prototype with done in Adobe XD can interact with my prototype using a PlayStation or Xbox controller. Using an actual game controller gives a better impression and sense of immersion for users playing the prototype. Let me show you how I do this. In the interaction panel on the right-hand side in Adobe XD, I can select the keys and gamepad in the drop-down menu by simply pressing the corresponding face button on my controller. It is as simple as that. A connection has been made with the face button and the corresponding action. Once the interactive prototype is completed, I export each of these shapes from Adobe XD into Photoshop as a shape layer. A trick that I have and I would like to share with you is that when I'm building my art assets, I mostly use shape layers in Photoshop. The reason for this is that I prefer to work in a non-destructive way. In the past, I used to rasterize my layers, but when a change would be requested, I would have to start from scratch since my layers were rasterized. This is definitely not a good way to work. To avoid this, now I use layer styles in Photoshop. First, I need to create an outline of the shape in Adobe XD. Because I keep the scale and hierarchy from my prototype, and I want to mimic this into my Photoshop mockups. I copy the element from Adobe XD and paste it into Illustrator. I then select the element once more and I paste it into Photoshop. A paste option window will appear and provide me with the shape layers option. By having a shape layer in Photoshop, I am able to add layer styles. I can even go online and download some layer styles library as a starting point. I could also use my presets previously loaded from my Adobe Cloud library. Here's an example of a button that I created. You see, I created a PSD folder, which consists of numerous shape layers with layer styles. And here's the result. As I mentioned, I built the button by only using shape layers and layer styles. By using layer style, it's very easy to start changing the look and the aesthetic of the button in a non-destructive way. I'd like to share another tip when dealing with layer styles in Photoshop. You can modify your layer style by selecting the effect you would like to modify. For this example, let's say I select the drop shadow. You can change the orientation of the drop shadow by moving the mouse onto the canvas. I can also do the same effect for inner shadows, pattern overlay, and gradient. Because this button needs multiple states such as default, hover, and press, I generate a folder for each different states. By selecting the default folder and dragging it on top of the new layer icon and duplicating the folder. Next step would be to rename the duplicate folder to the different states, hover and press. For example, in the hover state, I select certain shape layers and modify the layer style to illustrate the state of change. By changing the default colors of the blue elements to orange, I illustrate that the player has interacted with the button. Same things goes with the press state. I am able to add and modify my layer to represent a different state. Once I have all the states in the PSD folder and everything is named accordingly, I duplicate the PSD folder and rename PNG. Depending on what type of game engine the studio is using, I will name the folder PNG for best practices. Once the folder is renamed, I will select the subfolder for each of the different states and I will merge all the layers from the folder into one simple layer by pressing Ctrl or Command E. At this point, I will have two main folders with several subfolders for the different states. Inside the PNG folder are all my rasterized layers, which have been merged into the button states I need: default, hover, and press. Inside the PSD folder, I do not rasterize any of my layers. This is because down the road, if you're required to make a modification to the button, you simply go back into your PSD folder, make the change, and repeat the process for your PNG folder. You see, having a PSD folder avoids rasterizing your layers, and you can modify any layers very easily moving forward. And having a PNG folder, you can export all of your PNG files by using Export Layers to File. Another small trick that I would like to share is using a white, gray, black, solid color background when building art assets. For example, if you're creating a reticle in your HUD, always make sure that your element looks good on white, gray, and black background. The reason for this is that you want to make sure that your element is fully visible on any type of color values in the background. Example being, if you build a white reticle and during gameplay the player looks up at the sky, the white reticle might not be visible on white clouds. Since the reticle would be very difficult to view, it ruins the user experience. A good habit to have is to make sure that the UI element you create is visible on all shades of black to white. Now that I have shown you a bit of the process of what a UX and UI team could look like and shared some tips and tricks on how to build my art assets, I'd like to finish by showing you my high-fidelity mock-ups prototype for BATTLERIGS. But first, let's recap what we've learned during my talk. We identify and discuss the different role of a UI team and their contribution to the team. I shared with you some new and exciting feature of Adobe XD, how to use a gaming controller as an input in an Adobe XD prototype. Describe the benefit of using scale, proportions, and hierarchy in your UX design. And lastly, I shared newest tips and tricks on how I build my art assets, organize my Photoshop files, and how I work in a non-destructive way. Now, getting back to my high-fidelity mock-up of BATTLERIGS, I built a basic wireframe first, and by doing this, I zeroed in into the visual style of the game. I knew what type of audience I was trying to target and use fictional personas as well. I wanted a style that was fun, dynamic, and gender neutral. It was important to have a wireframe reflect the sense of scale and hierarchy in the menus. As I mentioned earlier, by building an art asset library and using the shape layers with layer styles, I was able to build my assets library fairly quickly while working in a non-destructive way by having a PSD and PNG folder in my layers. Here's a look at my high-fidelity mock-up of BATTLERIGS. By having a high-fidelity mock-up, everyone on the team gets a sense of the visual style and the type of animation that can be put into the prototype. You can view both of my BATTLERIGS prototype on my website, stephandube.com. If UX and UI in the video game interests you, I would encourage you to join my UIP Facebook group. I post content that is related to UX and UI designers in the video game industry on a regular basis. I really hope you enjoyed my talk and possibly learned a few things. Thank you so much for your time, and I would also like to thank Adobe team for inviting me. I am so grateful for this amazing opportunity. Thank you for watching, and feel free to reach out to me on my social media. Merci, cheers, thank you.